The sky was just beginning to brighten when Thomas Reed pulled on his worn fishing boots and grabbed his tackle box from the garage shelf. The cool morning air filled his lungs as he stepped out onto his back porch, his eyes drawn to the small lake that stretched behind his modest home. The water looked like glass, reflecting the pink-orange glow of sunrise, with wisps of fog dancing across its surface. 2 years ago, Thomas had bought this little house on the edge of Pinewood Estates, after months of searching. It wasn't anything fancy, just a simple 2-bedroom with faded blue siding and a patch of wildflowers instead of a proper garden. But the moment he'd seen that lake, he knew this was home. "Morning, old friend," he whispered to the water as he made his way down the gentle slope of his backyard. His footsteps left dark prints in the dew-covered grass. The fishing rod felt right in his hands, not the expensive kind that the sporting goods stores tried to sell, but his father's old rod that had caught more fish than Thomas could count. He'd fixed it up, replaced the line, and kept it oiled. Some mornings, when the light hit just right, he could almost feel his dad standing beside him, offering quiet advice about where the fish might be biting. On the opposite shore stood the fancy houses of Lakeside Heights, big brick homes with perfect green lawns that never seemed to grow too long and boats that rarely touched the water. Their docks stretched out like fingers pointing accusingly at Thomas's humble shoreline. The neighborhood had those 3 dreaded letters attached to it: HOA, Homeowners Association. Thomas thanked his lucky stars every day that his little piece of paradise fell just outside their territory. He cast his line with practiced ease, watching it arc through the morning light before landing with a soft plop near a cluster of lily pads. The ripples spread outward, disturbing the perfect mirror of the water. Then stillness returned and Thomas settled in to wait. Patience. That's what fishing had taught him. Life moves at its own pace, and sometimes all you can do is be still and present. This quiet ritual had saved him after losing Jenny. 3. Years had passed since cancer took his wife, but some days the pain felt as fresh as yesterday. Those were the days he needed the lake the most. Thomas worked at the county water treatment facility as an environmental engineer. Not the kind of job that impressed people at parties, but it suited him. He understood water, its power, its patterns, its importance. Water couldn't be rushed or forced. It always found its own path eventually. Like grief, he supposed. A gentle tug on his line pulled him from his thoughts. He smiled, feeling that familiar spark of excitement as he began, the delicate dance of reeling in his catch. A few minutes later, he was admiring a beautiful spotted bass, its scales catching the morning light like tiny mirrors. "You're a handsome fella," Thomas told the fish before carefully unhooking it. He took a quick picture with his phone. Nothing fancy, just the fish held up against the backdrop of the lake, then gently released it back into the water. He watched as it darted away, disappearing into the depths. That evening, Thomas uploaded the photo to the local community forum, along with a few tips about which bait had worked. He'd been doing this for months now, sharing his catches and knowledge without much thought. It was just nice to connect with other people who appreciated the simple joy of fishing. What Thomas didn't expect was how his posts would catch on. First, it was just comments and questions, then private messages asking for advice. Before long, actual people started showing up at the lake, regular folks from the surrounding neighborhoods with their kids in tow, eager to learn from the man they'd started calling the Fish Whisperer. The first time a father and son asked if they could fish near him, Thomas had been startled. He wasn't used to company, but the boy's excitement when he caught his first bluegill was infectious, his face lighting up with pride as Thomas showed him how to properly hold the fish for a photo. "My dad never taught me stuff like this," the man had said quietly while his son ran to show his mother the picture. "Thanks for taking the time." Those words stayed with Thomas, warming something inside him that had been cold for too long. Soon, weekends at the lake took on a new rhythm. Thomas would arrive at dawn for his peaceful solo fishing, but by mid-morning, the shoreline near his property would come alive with families spreading out blankets, setting up fishing chairs, and calling cheerful greetings. He found himself teaching knot tying to awkward teenagers, helping little ones bait their hooks and swapping fishing stories with grandparents who remembered when the lake was twice its current size. For the first time since Jenny died, Thomas felt something like joy taking root in his heart again. These people weren't just fishing buddies, they were becoming a community, his community. Some days, someone would bring homemade sandwiches to share, or a thermos of hot coffee when the morning was particularly chilly. One family even gave Thomas a hand-painted coffee mug with a fish design, which quickly became his favorite. "You've brought life back to this place," said Carol, a retired teacher who came most Saturdays with her grandkids. "It used to be so quiet here, like the lake was just for looking at, not living with." Thomas hadn't realized how much he'd needed these connections until they were there, filling the empty spaces in his days with voices and laughter. The lake felt more alive somehow, as if it too appreciated the renewed attention. But not everyone was pleased with the change. Thomas first noticed the stares from the lakeside heights side of the water, people on their expensive decks looking through binoculars, pointing, talking behind manicured hands. Then came the security guards in crisp uniforms, patrolling the northern shore more frequently. The tension finally broke surface one sunny Saturday in June. Thomas was helping a group of kids identify different fish species when a sleek boat cut across the lake, making a beeline for his shore. At the helm stood Barbara Wilson, president of the Lakeside Heights HOA, her honey blonde hair perfectly styled despite the boat's speed, her smile tight and unfriendly as she approached. The boat's wake rocked the peaceful shore, sending ripples through the previously calm water, a perfect metaphor, Thomas would later think, for what was about to happen to his quiet life by the lake. Barbara Wilson's boat cut through the water like a knife, sending ripples across the peaceful lake surface. Thomas stood up straighter as she approached, instinctively moving to stand between her and the children who had been listening to his fish stories just moments before. "Good morning," Thomas called out, trying to keep his voice friendly despite the knot forming in his stomach. The boat slowed, its engine gurgling as Barbara guided it to a stop just a few feet from shore. "Mr. Reed," she said, not bothering to return his greeting. Her eyes swept over the gathered families with barely disguised distaste. She wore expensive-looking sunglasses and a white blouse that probably cost more than Thomas's entire wardrobe. "I see you've turned our lake into quite the public attraction." Thomas noticed how she said "our lake" and felt a flash of irritation. "It's a beautiful day for fishing," he replied evenly. "These folks are just enjoying nature, same as anyone else." A boy next to Thomas proudly held up a small perch he'd caught. "Look what Mr. Thomas helped me catch." The child's face was beaming with excitement. Barbara's lips tightened into something that was trying to be a smile but didn't quite make it. "How quaint." She turned her attention back to Thomas. "Perhaps you aren't aware, but this increased activity is causing concern among Lakeside Heights residents. The noise, the crowds, it's becoming a problem." Thomas glanced around at the so-called crowds. Just 3 families with their lawn chairs and picnic coolers, hardly the rowdy gathering she was making it out to be. "We're just fishing quietly, Barbara. Nobody's causing any trouble." "The board sees it differently," she replied coolly. "We've invested a lot in maintaining the quality and exclusivity of our community." She emphasized the word exclusivity, like it was something precious. "We'll be taking steps to address the situation." Before Thomas could ask what that meant, she revved the boat's engine and pulled away, leaving everyone on shore exchanging confused looks. "Is everything okay, Mr. Thomas?" asked the boy with the perch. Thomas ruffled the kid's hair. "Don't you worry about it. Let's get that fish back in the water, shall we?" But inside, Thomas felt uneasy. The confrontation with Barbara had cast a shadow over the sunny morning. He didn't have to wait long to find out what taking steps meant. 3 days later, Thomas woke up to find large, professionally printed signs had appeared overnight along the northern shoreline. Private property. Lakeside Heights residents only, no trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted. The signs were mounted on metal posts driven deep into the ground, spaced every 50 feet or so along the HOA's side of the lake. They faced outward, like sentinels warning away intruders. Thomas spent his lunch break at the county records office. The next day, poring over property maps and deeds. Just as he'd thought, the lake itself was public property, a natural water feature that couldn't be privately owned under state law. The Lakeside Heights properties extended to the shoreline, but not into the water. The signs were misleading at best, outright lies at worst. Armed with this knowledge, Thomas printed out the relevant documents and tucked them into his fishing vest. He wasn't looking for a fight, but he wanted to be prepared if anyone challenged the family's right to be there. That weekend, fewer people showed up to fish. Those who did kept glancing nervously at the signs. "Don't let them scare you," Thomas told Carol and her grandkids when they arrived. "I checked the records. The lake is public property. They can't stop us from fishing here." Still, an uncomfortable feeling hung in the air, as tangible as the humidity before a storm. The feeling grew worse when a black SUV with Lakeside Heights security, painted on its doors, began making regular passes along the road behind Thomas's house. Men in uniform would park and watch through binoculars, taking notes on clipboards. Sometimes they'd shine powerful flashlights toward the lake at night, the beams cutting through the darkness to Thomas's back porch where he sat drinking his evening tea. "It's intimidation, pure and simple," said Mike, a plumber who had become one of the regular weekend fishermen. "They can't legally keep us away, so they're trying to make us uncomfortable enough to leave on our own." Thomas hated to admit it, but the tactics were working. The number of families visiting the lake dwindled each weekend. Parents didn't want their children feeling unwelcome or watched. The laughter and gentle conversations that had brought the shoreline to life were fading away. Then came the morning when Thomas found himself alone on the lake for the first time in months. The silence felt wrong now, empty rather than peaceful. He caught a beautiful bass but had no one to share the moment with. When he released the fish back into the water, he wondered if this was how things would be from now on, back to solitude, but this time with the bitter taste of defeat. He was packing up his gear. The sound of an expensive car pulling up made him turn. Barbara Wilson stepped out wearing crisp white pants and a blue silk top that probably cost more than Thomas's monthly mortgage payment. "Mr. Reed," she said, walking down to where he stood. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" "It was," Thomas replied, unable to keep the edge from his voice. Barbara looked around at the empty shoreline with satisfaction. "I see your friends haven't joined you today." "I wonder why," Thomas said dryly. She ignored his tone. "This lake has been the crown jewel of Lakeside Heights for over 20 years. Our community was built around it. The exclusivity of our access is reflected in our property values." She spoke like someone giving a rehearsed speech. "Our members pay substantial HOA fees to maintain the pristine nature of this amenity." "The lake is public property," Thomas said, pulling the documents from his vest pocket. "I checked the county records myself." Barbara didn't even glance at the papers. "County records can be reinterpreted. We have friends in the zoning department who understand the importance of protecting property investments." Her smile never reached her eyes. "And we have very deep pockets for legal battles should it come to that. Do you, Mr. Reed?" The threat hung in the air between them. Thomas knew he couldn't afford a lengthy court battle against the well-funded HOA, even if he was in the right. "Perhaps you should find another hobby," Barbara suggested, her voice sickly sweet, "one that doesn't involve our lake." As she walked back to her car, Thomas felt a burning mix of anger and helplessness. But that feeling was quickly replaced by concern when he noticed something odd about the water near his feet. A small fish was swimming in tight, disoriented circles, bumping repeatedly against a rock before floating belly up to the surface. Thomas frowned and looked closer at the water. Now that he was paying attention, he could see other signs something wasn't right. A faint, oily sheen on the surface near the Lakeside Heights docks, and what looked like a white powder residue along some of the rocks. That evening, Joe, another regular fisherman, called Thomas with disturbing news. "I drove by the lake last night around 11, Joe said, his voice tense. "Saw someone on the HOA dock dumping something into the water from big white buckets. Couldn't see who it was in the dark, but they were wearing the Lakeside Heights maintenance uniform." Thomas's heart sank. As an environmental engineer at the water treatment plant, he knew exactly what this might mean. The HOA had moved beyond signs and intimidation. They were willing to harm the lake itself to get their way. "I'll check it out," Thomas promised, already planning how he would collect water samples to test at his workplace lab. As he hung up the phone, he looked out his kitchen window toward the darkening lake and wondered just how far Barbara Wilson and her HOA were willing to go to keep their crown jewel to themselves. The next morning, Thomas woke before sunrise. He moved quietly through his house, gathering empty jars he'd washed and set aside the night before. Each one was labeled with masking tape, ready for water samples. As an environmental engineer, he knew exactly what to look for and how to collect evidence properly. The lake was eerily still as Thomas slipped his small rowboat into the water. Mist hung low over the surface, turning the world gray and mysterious. He rowed carefully, trying not to make too much noise as he made his way to different spots around the lake. At each location, he filled a jar with water, sealed it tight, and made notes about where and when it was collected. Near the Lakeside Heights docks, Thomas noticed a strange smell, something chemical and sharp that didn't belong in nature. The water here had a slight discoloration, barely visible in the early morning light. He took extra samples from this area, his concern growing with each jar he filled. Back at home, Thomas placed the samples in a small cooler. He wasn't supposed to use the lab equipment at work for personal matters, but he couldn't think of another way to get accurate results. Besides, if someone was poisoning the lake, wasn't that a public health concern? His job was to protect water, quality after all. After his regular shift ended, Thomas stayed late, waiting until most of his co-workers had left before carrying his cooler of samples into the testing area. For the next 2 hours, he ran various tests, checking for contaminants, abnormal pH levels, and toxic substances. The results made his stomach drop. 3 of the samples, all from near the Lakeside Heights docks, showed high levels of copper sulfate, a chemical commonly used to control algae in pools and decorative ponds. In small doses, it wasn't particularly harmful, but these concentrations were dangerously high, enough to kill fish and damage the ecosystem. "Those idiots," Thomas muttered, staring at the test results. "Don't they understand what they're doing?" He printed out the analysis and tucked the papers into his bag. On his way home, he called Joe, the fisherman who had spotted someone dumping substances into the lake. "It's definitely copper sulfate," Thomas explained. "They're probably trying to make the lake less attractive for fishing." "Can't you report them?" Joe asked. "Isn't that illegal?" "It should be," Thomas sighed. "But I need proof they're the ones doing it." The next day, Thomas visited the County Environmental Protection Office. He brought his test results and a written report explaining his concerns. The woman at the front desk took his paperwork with a polite smile and promised someone would look into it. "Ask for Dave Wilson in water quality," she suggested. "He handles these kinds of complaints." Thomas froze at the name. "Wilson? Any relation to Barbara Wilson from Lakeside Heights?" The receptionist's smile became strained. "That's his wife, actually. Do you know her?" Thomas's heart sank. No wonder Barbara had seemed so confident about having friends in the county offices. He thanked the receptionist and left, knowing his report would likely be buried before anyone took action. That night, Thomas called his old college roommate, Andy Powell, who now worked as an environmental journalist for the local newspaper. "Need your help," Thomas explained, detailing the situation with the lake and the HOA. "I've got water test results showing contamination, but I can't prove who's doing it." "Sounds like we need to catch them in the act," Andy replied. "Got any ideas?" By the next afternoon, Andy had brought over some equipment that looked like it belonged in a spy movie rather than a journalist's kit. Tiny wildlife cameras disguised as birdhouses and rocks. "These are from my nature photography days," Andy explained as they carefully placed the cameras around Thomas's property. "Motion activated and weatherproof. If anyone's dumping chemicals into that lake, we'll get it on video." For 3 nights, nothing happened. Thomas checked the camera footage each morning, but the only visitors to the lakeside were raccoons and the occasional deer. On the 4th night, however, everything changed. Thomas was awakened at 2 a.m. by his phone buzzing with text messages from Andy. "Check the cameras now," the first message read, followed by, "Got them red-handed." Heart pounding, Thomas downloaded the footage from the cameras. There it was, clear as day, despite the darkness. Two men in Lakeside Heights maintenance uniforms were at the community dock, emptying large white buckets into the water. The infrared camera captured every detail, including the labels on the buckets that clearly read, "Copper sulfate, danger." "We've got them," Thomas whispered to himself, a mix of vindication and anger washing over him. The next day, armed with the video evidence and his water test results, Thomas and Andy formulated a plan. The HOA had scheduled its monthly meeting for that evening, a meeting that was technically open to the public, though outsiders rarely attended. Thomas spent the day rehearsing what he would say, trying to keep his anger in check. This wasn't just about his right to fish anymore. It was about protecting the lake from people who claimed to care about it, but were willing to poison it for their own purposes. That evening, Thomas wore his one good shirt and arrived early at the Lakeside Heights Community Center. He sat quietly in the back as residents filtered in, many giving him curious or hostile glances. Barbara Wilson was at the front of the room, shuffling papers and whispering with other board members. When the meeting began, Thomas waited patiently through discussions about lawn height requirements and a heated debate about permitted fence colors. Finally, during the public comment period, he raised his hand. Barbara's smile tightened when she saw him. "Mr. Reed, this is unexpected. Do you have a comment about HOA matters?" "I do," Thomas said, standing up. Every eye in the room turned to him as he walked to the front, clutching a folder of papers. "I'd like to discuss the lake, specifically what's being done to it." "The lake is not on tonight's agenda," Barbara said sharply. "And frankly, as a non-resident, I have evidence," Thomas continued, his voice steady despite his racing heart, "that someone has been dumping copper sulfate into the lake at dangerous levels that kill fish and harm wildlife." A murmur ran through the crowd of homeowners. "That's a serious accusation," Barbara said, her voice cold. "Do you have any proof of who might be doing such a thing?" Thomas nodded. "I do, actually." He turned to face the homeowners rather than the board. "I have video footage of Lakeside Heights maintenance staff dumping chemicals into the lake in the middle of the night. I have water samples showing toxic levels of copper sulfate. And I have the test results to prove it." The room erupted in confused conversation. Barbara banged her gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order. "We occasionally treat the water for excessive algae growth," she announced when the noise died down. "It's standard lake management, completely normal and approved by the board." "At 3 in the morning?" Thomas challenged. "At levels 10 times the recommended dose?" Before Barbara could respond, the community center doors opened, and Andy walked in with a camera operator from the local news station. Barbara's face drained of color. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded. "No media is allowed at our meetings." Andy smiled pleasantly. "I'm doing a story on water quality issues in the county. Mr. Reed's findings about copper sulfate contamination are quite newsworthy, don't you think? Especially the video evidence." Thomas watched as Barbara's carefully constructed control began to crumble. Some homeowners were now asking pointed questions about the lake treatment, wanting to know if it was safe for their pets and children. "The story airs tomorrow morning," Andy told the room. "We'd love to include the HOA's official response about why they're poisoning their own lake." Thomas hadn't planned on bringing in the news, but he had to admit Andy's flair for the dramatic was effective. The smug confidence that Barbara had shown when threatening him was gone, replaced by barely controlled panic as she tried to manage the situation. As the meeting dissolved into chaos, an older man sitting in the front row turned to stare at Thomas. Unlike the others, he wasn't shouting or demanding answers. He was simply watching Thomas with a thoughtful expression, almost respectful. Thomas would later learn this was Dr. Howard Lee, a retired water quality scientist who had just moved to Lakeside Heights. But in that moment, all Thomas knew was that for the first time since this battle began, someone from the other side seemed to actually see him. The morning after the HOA meeting, Thomas's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Andy's news story had hit the local stations, and suddenly everyone wanted to talk to the man who stood up to Lakeside Heights. Thomas ignored most of the calls, uncomfortable with the sudden attention. He wasn't looking for fame. He just wanted the lake to be safe again. He was making coffee when his work phone rang. Seeing his supervisor's number, he answered with a sinking feeling in his stomach. "Thomas, I need you to come in right away," said Bill, his boss at the water treatment facility. The urgency in his voice made Thomas forget about his half-made breakfast. "What's wrong?" Thomas asked, already reaching for his keys. "Just get here," Bill said. "Now." 30 minutes later, Thomas was staring at test results that made his coffee curdle in his stomach. Routine water quality tests had detected trace amounts of copper sulfate in the county water supply. The levels weren't dangerous yet, barely detectable in fact, but any contamination was cause for concern. "We need to find the source," Bill said, running a hand through his thinning hair. "This isn't supposed to be in our water at all." Thomas said nothing, connecting dots in his head. The copper sulfate in the lake and now in the water supply, they had to be related. But how? The county got its water from the municipal reservoir miles away from the lake. "Where exactly were these samples taken?" Thomas asked, examining the paperwork. Bill pointed to a map on the wall. "That's the strange part. It's only showing up in the lines that feed Lakeside Heights. The rest of the county is clean." Thomas frowned. "That doesn't make sense. Lakeside Heights gets the same water as everyone else, right?" Bill shook his head. "Actually, no. They negotiated a special arrangement about 15 years ago. They have their own supply." "From where?" Thomas asked, though he was beginning to suspect the answer. "They tap directly into the aquifer with private wells," Bill explained. "Minimal treatment, just enough to meet regulations. They market it as pure spring water to their residents. It's one of their selling points. No municipal water for them." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "And where does the aquifer get its water from?" Bill's eyes met his. "It's fed by underground streams and—" He paused, realization dawning on his face. "And by seepage from the lake." Thomas thought about the copper sulfate being dumped into the lake, slowly making its way into the groundwater, filtering through the soil into the aquifer, and finally into the expensive faucets of Lakeside Heights homes. "They're poisoning their own water supply," Thomas whispered. "They don't know what they're doing." "Or they do and they don't care," Bill replied grimly. "Either way, we need to shut this down now." For the next hour, they pored over old maps and water survey reports tracing the path from the lake to the aquifer to the Lakeside Heights water system. The connection was undeniable. The fancy neighborhood that had been polluting the lake to keep undesirables away was literally drinking from the same source they were poisoning. "The levels are low now," Bill explained. "But if they keep dumping chemicals at the rate they have been, it's going to get worse. Much worse." "What happens then?" Thomas asked. "Best case? Just bad taste and complaints. Worst case? Illness, especially in children and the elderly. Copper toxicity isn't something to mess around with." Thomas thought about all those perfect houses with their perfect lawns, filled with families who had no idea what their HOA was doing to their water. Whatever he thought about Barbara Wilson and her board, the residents didn't deserve this. "We need to call an emergency meeting," Thomas said. "Not just with the HOA board, with everyone, all the residents, the county health department, everyone." Bill nodded, already reaching for the phone. "I'll make the calls." By that afternoon, word had spread through official channels. The county health department issued an advisory for Lakeside Heights residents to use bottled water until further notice. News vans parked at the entrance to the neighborhood, reporters eager for follow-up to the morning's story about the lake poisoning. Thomas felt a strange mix of vindication and worry as he drove to the hastily organized meeting at the Lakeside Heights Community Center. He'd been fighting to save his fishing spot, but now the stakes were much higher. The community center was packed when he arrived. Angry residents were demanding answers, many clutching bottles of water they'd rushed out to buy after the health advisory. The HOA board sat at the front, Barbara Wilson looking pale and defensive as she tried to maintain order. At the back of the room, County officials huddled with water quality experts, reviewing test results and maps. Bill waved Thomas over to join them. "The residents don't know the full story yet," Bill said quietly. "Just that there's some contamination in their water. The board is trying to spin it as an outside problem, nothing to do with them." Thomas scanned the crowd and spotted Andy near the front, notebook in hand. Their eyes met, and Andy gave him a small nod. He was ready to help get the truth out. Before Thomas could respond to Bill, the room fell silent as a distinguished-looking older man took the microphone. It was Dr. Howard Lee, the man who had watched Thomas so thoughtfully at the previous meeting. "For those who don't know me, I'm Howard Lee," he began, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "I moved here 3 months ago after retiring from 30 years as a hydrologist with the EPA." Murmurs spread through the crowd. Barbara Wilson shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "I've reviewed the preliminary water quality reports," Dr. Lee continued, "and I've examined the local hydrological surveys. There's no doubt that the contamination in our water supply is directly linked to the substances being introduced into the lake." "That's speculation," Barbara interrupted. "We don't know where the contamination is coming from. It could be from anywhere." Dr. Lee fixed her with a stern look. "Mrs. Wilson, I've been tracking water contamination patterns since before you were on the HOA board. This isn't speculation, it's science." He turned back to the residents. "Our beautiful homes sit atop an aquifer that is fed in part by the lake behind our properties. That same lake that, according to news reports and water quality tests, has been deliberately contaminated with copper sulfate at levels far exceeding what's safe or legal." The room erupted in angry voices. Parents wanted to know if their children were at risk. Older residents worried about health effects. Everyone wanted to know who was responsible. Thomas stepped forward, holding up the maps and test results he and Bill had compiled. "I can show exactly how the water flows from the lake to your taps," he offered. "It's all documented." Barbara Wilson stood up, her face flushed. "This is absurd. We treated the lake for algae, yes, but in a completely standard way. If there's a problem with the water supply, it must be from some other source." "Then explain this," Thomas said, passing the wildlife camera footage to Andy, who connected it to the room's projector. The entire room watched in stunned silence as the video showed Lakeside Heights maintenance workers dumping bucket after bucket of chemicals into the lake in the middle of the night. When the lights came back on, all eyes turned to the HOA board. "Those men were following orders," Thomas said quietly. "The question is, whose orders?" A woman in the front row stood up, a crying child on her hip. "My daughter's been having stomach pain for 2 weeks. The doctor couldn't figure out why." Is this related?" The county health officer stepped forward. "We can't say for certain yet, ma'am, but it's possible. We're recommending everyone switch to bottled water immediately while we investigate further. Anyone experiencing symptoms should see their doctor right away." As fear and anger filled the room, Thomas watched the realization spreading across people's faces. The exclusive water system they'd been so proud of, the pure spring water they'd paid premium HOA fees to maintain, had become their greatest vulnerability. The lake wasn't just a scenic view or a property value enhancer. It was literally the source of what kept them alive. And in trying to keep others away from it, they'd poisoned themselves. The weeks that followed the emergency meeting were a blur of activity. Water trucks arrived daily at Lakeside Heights, distributing bottled water to residents while teams of environmental experts tested homes and examined the contamination spread. Yellow caution tape surrounded the lake, keeping everyone away while cleanup efforts began. Thomas found himself unexpectedly at the center of it all. As the person who had first identified the problem, his expertise was suddenly in demand. County officials consulted him about water flow patterns. News reporters sought his perspective on the situation. Even some Lakeside Heights residents, once distant and suspicious, now approached him with gratitude for bringing the contamination to light. "I never thought I'd say this," admitted one woman who lived in one of the largest homes overlooking the lake. "But thank you for being so stubborn about fishing here. If you hadn't noticed what was happening, who knows how sick we might have gotten." The fallout for the HOA was swift and severe. State environmental investigators found that Barbara Wilson had authorized the chemical dumping without proper permits or board approval. The maintenance workers provided signed statements, confirming they were following her direct orders. By the end of the week, Barbara had resigned from the board, and rumors circulated that she and her husband were quietly putting their house on the market. The remaining board members, desperate to avoid lawsuits from their own residents, voted unanimously to cooperate fully with the investigation and remediation efforts. They hired an environmental consulting firm to assess the damage and develop a cleanup plan. The estimated cost made them blanch, nearly $500,000, but they had little choice. Thomas was sitting on his back porch one evening, watching the sunset reflect on the empty lake when a knock came at his front door. He was surprised to find Dr. Howard Lee standing there, a thick folder tucked under his arm. "Hope I'm not disturbing you," the older man said with a warm smile. "I wanted to discuss something important." Over cups of tea at Thomas's kitchen table, Dr. Lee explained that the HOA board had appointed him as interim president. "My first order of business," he said, spreading out documents from his folder, "is to make things right, not just for our residents but for the lake itself and everyone who should be able to enjoy it." The papers outlined a comprehensive lake restoration plan. It would take time, at least 6 months before the water would be safe for fishing, again, but the approach was scientifically sound. What caught Thomas off guard was the final page, a proposal to establish a permanent conservation easement around the entire lake, protecting it as a public natural resource forever. "We need someone to head up a new lake management committee," Dr. Lee said, looking pointedly at Thomas. "Someone who understands water quality and actually cares about the lake for more than property values." Thomas was speechless for a moment. "You want me to work with Lakeside Heights, after everything that happened?" Dr. Lee nodded. "Especially after everything that happened. We need to rebuild trust, and you've earned the respect of both sides. Plus," he added with a small smile, "you're the only one who's proven they'll stand up and fight when something's wrong." Thomas thought about it for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "I'll do it. For the lake." The restoration work began immediately. Special equipment was brought in to treat the contaminated water. Biologists monitored the surviving fish and plant life, tracking the ecosystem's recovery. Thomas worked closely with the environmental teams, often spending his weekends helping. With the cleanup efforts, the most surprising part was how the community began to change. Residents from Lakeside Heights showed up in work clothes, volunteering to help with the restoration. Kids from Thomas's fishing group came with their parents to learn about water, quality, and ecosystem health. Walls that had once divided the lakeside community started to crumble. One Saturday morning, about 3 months into the restoration, Thomas was helping a group of volunteers plant native water lilies along the shoreline when he noticed a familiar face. A teenage boy who had been one of his first fishing students was carefully showing a small group of Lakeside Heights children how to plant the delicate flowers. "You want to make sure the roots are covered but not too deep," the boy explained patiently. "These plants help clean the water naturally." Thomas smiled, realizing that something new and unexpected was growing alongside the recovering plant life, a sense of shared responsibility for the lake that connected them all. The restoration took longer than anyone hoped. For nearly 6 months, the lake remained off-limits for fishing or any water activities. Thomas used this time to develop educational programs, teaching workshops about watershed protection and sustainable fishing practices. To his surprise, these sessions were attended by people from all the surrounding neighborhoods, including many Lakeside Heights residents. "I never knew how much was happening beneath the surface," said one man who had previously complained about outsiders using the lake. "I've lived here for 8 years and never really understood how it all works together." Though most of the original board members had stepped down in disgrace, Dr. Lee was building a new leadership approach that valued transparency and community involvement. Under his guidance, the HOA revised its policies, removing restrictions that had once made the lake feel like private property. The day finally came when the environmental experts declared the lake safe again. Thomas helped organize a community-wide fishing tournament to celebrate, with proceeds benefiting local water conservation efforts. The event drew families from all the surrounding neighborhoods, mixing freely without the invisible boundaries that had once divided them. The morning of the tournament dawned clear and cool, with mist rising from the lake surface just like in the old days. Thomas arrived early to set up, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction as he looked out over the healing water. A great blue heron stood motionless at the edge, hunting for breakfast, a good sign that the ecosystem was coming back to life. As the sun rose higher, people began to arrive with fishing poles and picnic baskets. Thomas noticed Dr. Lee helping his grandchildren bait their hooks near the shoreline that had once been marked with no trespassing signs. "First time fishing?" Thomas asked, approaching the family. The little girl nodded shyly, while her brother proudly declared, "Grandpa says you're the best fisherman on the whole lake." Dr. Lee smiled. "I also told them you're the man who saved our lake when the rest of us didn't even know it needed saving." Thomas felt his cheeks warm with embarrassment. The lake did most of the saving itself. Nature's pretty good at healing, if we just stop making things worse and give it a chance. As more families arrived, Thomas found himself drawn to the spot where he'd first confronted Barbara Wilson all those months ago. Her house now had a "for sale" sign in the yard, the pristine lawn beginning to show signs of neglect. Thomas felt no satisfaction in her downfall, only hope that whoever moved in next would understand what the lake truly meant to everyone. A small tug on his sleeve pulled him from his thoughts. A boy of about 7 was looking up at him with serious eyes, holding a fishing rod nearly twice his height. "Mr. Thomas, can you show me where the good fishing spots are?" he asked. "My dad says you know all the secrets." Thomas smiled and knelt down to the child's level. "The real secret," he said, "is that there are no secrets. The lake belongs to all of us, and it's up to all of us to take care of it." As he helped the boy cast his line into the sparkling water, Thomas looked around at the diverse group of people enjoying the lake together. Young and old, wealthy and working class, all connected by this small body of water that had almost been destroyed by selfishness but was now bringing them together. The lake had found a way to teach them all an important lesson. Whatever we do to nature, we ultimately do to ourselves. And in healing the lake, perhaps they had begun to heal the divisions in their community as well, the end